All right. Good afternoon, everybody. We are so excited to have you all here today. My name is Michael Ramirez. I'm the education manager here at Jane Addams Hull-House Museum, and we are very excited to be hosting our first of 4 educator-created and led programs here at the museum. Today is our homework help ask me anything session with our 2 great educators, Audrey and Eddie. Who will be joining us shortly. They have their cameras on so I can see them. But today's conversation, we are here to answer your questions. We received quite a few questions throughout the year from all different kinds of people regarding all aspects of Hull House's history. So we're excited to host this session and answer any burning questions about Jane Addams, Hull House, the legacy, the Near West Side, Chicago, you name it, we can hopefully answer all of your questions. Just a couple of quick housekeeping rules. There is the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the Zoom webinar. We do ask that anyone who asks a question to submit them through there. And myself and our other amazing educator, Nadia, will be monitoring the chat and asking those questions as they come in. We also have our curatorial manager, Ross, who will help with any technical difficulties that we might have and also helping to moderate things as well. Again, this is our first of 4 educator-led events that we are going to be hosting here throughout the rest of the year while we are a virtual museum. But we have some other amazing programs that are coming up, 2 of which are happening this next week. So the first one is happening on Tuesday, September 29th from 4 to 5 p.m., which is our partnership with the Chicago History Museum, where I will be leading a virtual discussion and tour about Jane Addams and the activist legacy of Hull House. We'll be exploring our 2 current exhibitions, Why Women Should Vote, as well as the exhibition True Peace, The Presence of Justice. This is a registered paid event. So for more information, feel free to visit our website, hullhousemuseum.org, as well as the Chicago History Museum website. We also have our second event happening next Saturday, October 3rd, which is the film screening and discussion for the new documentary Surge. This feature documentary is about the record number of first-time female candidates who ran, won, and upended politics in the historic 2018 midterm elections. This is a partnership between Jane Addams Hull-House Museum, the Chicago History Museum, Reaching Across Illinois Library System, Aurora Public Library, Gail Borden Public Library, Arlington Heights Memorial Library, Schaumburg Township District Library, and the DuSable Museum of African American History. This film screening and discussion will take place from 6 to 8 p.m. and will be joined by the U.S. Representative for Illinois' 14th District, Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, who's the youngest Black woman to serve in Congress. She'll be in talks with the filmmakers, Hannah Rosenwig and Wendy Sachs, to discuss the possibilities of women's political participation for the upcoming 2020 election. So we hope that you join us for not only these 2 events, but the many events that we have coming up over the next few months, which again can all be found on our website. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to our 2 educators who will lead our discussion for the next hour or so. Thank you all.
All right, everyone. So my name's Eddie.
Hi, everyone. My name's Audrey.
Yeah, so thank you so much for tuning in. So yeah, we'll be taking about the next hour or so to go through a lot of questions that we received throughout the years. Not to mention for the last couple of weeks, we've been actually taking in a lot of questions. So while this was kind of targeted towards students and younger folk, we actually were taking questions from pretty much anybody. Any burning questions you had about Hull House, its history, the neighborhood. And really, we want to be a resource for you all. Whether you're writing a paper, you have a test coming up, anything that comes to mind, we want to be a resource for you. So so while the museum, oops, sorry. Oh.
No, I was just going to say, if you have any questions as we're going through the program, leave them in the Facebook chat, and our other educator, Nadia, will be able to relay those questions to us in real time.
All right, very nice. So while we're here, so I think it's usually a big question that we get all the time is, what is Hull House? A lot of times students come in, they kind of just combines like, oh, why are we at this house? What is this museum? Why is a house a museum? So the Hull-House has a very long and rich history. So I always like to start off with the beginning before the house was even a thing. So back in the early 1800s, early mid 1800s, Chicago wasn't nearly as big as it is today. So back in the day, Hull-House, where it stands today on the near west side, kind of by where UIC is, was actually just outside of the Chicago city limits. So it's like it would be called a suburb if there were more things around it. But when the house was first built back in 1856, it was kind of by itself. So suburb, but not really. So the first owner and builder of the Hull-House was a man named Charles Hull. And what happened was this was kind of like a summer getaway home. So he stayed there for a number of years. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this in a later question. But when he passed, the houses eventually kind of went through a few hands until it ended up with Jane Addams. So the Hull-House had a long, rich history. And really, Jane Addams comes in around the late 1800s, around like 1880s, 1890s, kind of like within this time frame. A lot of things are rolling for Jane Addams. So Jane Addams, during this time, was actually having a lot of health issues. So she actually had a club foot and what's called Pott's disease. So this is a tuberculosis of the spine, causing a lot of spinal pain and issues. So during this time, she was actually taking medical leave, medical rest, and one of that included a vacation down to London, where she stumbled upon Toynbee Hall, one of the first settlement houses in the world. So a settlement house is essentially where people would come together, typically middle, upper class, educated folk, and they would pretty much live within a community to provide services. Toynbee Hall was a model that started off by Oxford and Cambridge students, and Jane Addams was really inspired by that. So she wanted to build one right here in Chicago. So through a bunch of different things that we'll talk more about in a different question, she came into possession of Hull-House, where it just snowballed and snowballed and snowballed until it grew as big as it was today. Oh, no, back then, not today. That's a big question. That's a teaser for another question. So what were they doing here at the Hull-House? So they were pretty much, it's not really a question of what were they doing, but what weren't they doing. So they were doing things like they had housing for volunteers, they were providing medical services, childcare, different art classes, and a whole bunch of mediums. There was even educational resources for both children and adults. There was a huge theater program that was actually really influential, especially here in Chicago. If you have a question on that, feel free to leave that in the chat. There was citizenship classes, English language classes, or ESL. There was a space for lectures, debates from people all across the world and all across the political spectrum. And it was a major meeting space for a lot of these organizing groups. And really, that was only the tip of the iceberg that happened in the long history of Hull-House. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. What wasn't done at Hull-House is more the question there. With all of these services, another question we often get is, was Hull-House a homeless shelter, right? And the Hull-House settlement, that settlement house title kind of makes it sound like a homeless shelter, but that was one of the things that Hull-House was not. Hull-House provided services and opportunities for neighbors in the area, but it only provided housing to volunteers who actually paid room and board to live at Hull-House. And in exchange for the privilege of working at Hull-House, they were able to live and work there and often conduct studies in the neighborhood. So that's actually a question we get a lot, even from history teachers who come into the museum, having taught that Hull-House was a homeless shelter. But the only people who were living at Hull-House, on Hull-House proper, were those typically wealthier people, college-educated people who were coming for the experience specifically to live and work there. Any of those people were called residents of Hull-House, and anyone in the surrounding neighborhood were called neighbors. Mm-hmm. So that's a really big question we usually get. At least I do. What about you, Eddie?
Yeah, so yeah, that's actually a pretty big misconception that we get. So while some of the neighbors were helping out a lot of families, especially if they're looking for stable housing, at its height, Hull House actually housed about 100 residents. So it's a pretty big complex back in the day. Actually, if you go on our website, we actually have a little virtual tour, and there usually would be able to see the model, but we actually managed to get photos of inside the model of the entire 13 building complex of Hull House. So you actually go down to our website, go down to virtual tour. You can actually click on through the museum. You can actually go into the model and see what daily life would look like for a lot of these residents and people, neighbors who would come from around the neighborhood walking through this space.
Mhm. It's really cool. I would highly recommend it, and not just because I work there. So the next question we get a lot is this one, which is, what is the deal with the devil baby?
So
Eddie,
actually, I'm gonna pin that for a quick second. I actually want to give any time for anyone in the chat, perhaps, anyone have any questions?
So it doesn't look like we have any yet. Nadia, I don't know if you have any on your end, but please feel free to chime in if there are any questions.
Cool. All right, back to the devil baby.
Yeah, so Eddie, what is this devil baby? I've heard so much about it. Is it real? Is it at Hull House right now? Can I go see it? What's the deal?
So yes, we actually have the devil baby. In the case, no, we're kidding. We don't. So the devil baby is probably one of our biggest selling points here at the museum. So I'm pretty sure if anyone who's really into paranormal, supernatural kind of stuff, especially in Chicago, the devil baby has definitely come up. So if you've watched anything about Chicago ghosts, anything about history, paranormal history here in Chicago, almost, I would honestly say 10 out of 10, the devil baby at Hull House is gonna come up. So the myth of the devil baby, kind of the basic version, is that there's two really major stories that come about the devil baby. The most famous one's probably going to be the Italian Catholic American version. So short version is essentially there was a newly Italian American family. The wife who was a devout Catholic, was was actually pregnant at the time, trying to spruce up the house a bit, and actually put up a picture of Jesus on the wall. So who she married was actually an atheist man. So when he came home and saw the picture of Jesus on the wall, he was furious. He tried to take the painting or picture off the wall, and he said, "I'd rather have a devil than that in the house." So, what we would call in the literary world a little teaser. I forget the word. I forget the word in my head.
Foreshadowing?
Yes, foreshadowing. AP Lit coming through. So yes. So a little bit of foreshadowing. A couple months, weeks later, the wife was giving birth, and the baby was born with horns and a tail. So obviously the parents were freaking out, and during their panic, actually left the baby at the doors of Hull House. So when the residents found it, they were also freaking out, and they're like, "We got to baptize this baby." So they try to get the baby to the church to get baptized, but allegedly the baby got up and started running off, where future stories allegedly had the baby living at the attic of Hull House, where Jane Addams took it until it died, where you can hear the crying even to this day. There's also the Jewish American version. So we're actually having a program in just a couple weeks, just in time for spooky season, October, where you can actually find more about stories about this at Hull House and go deeper into the ghosts and stories and things like that. So if you want more ghost stories, definitely check them out. We'll have more information in the coming weeks. But there's a lot of things that things that we come up about ghosts here at the Hull House. So sometimes we get people coming into the museum. We get the occasional paranormal investigation, people calling in asking, can we bring our thermal cameras or EEG devices or night vision cameras? Unfortunately, we do not allow paranormal investigations just because it might disrupt someone else's, museum experience, things like that. So just heads up. But it's actually a really good story and really good reflection on society. So during Jane Addams' time, she was actually flooded with stories and requests to go see the Devil Baby. So yeah, you can see from this image here, it was the media was everywhere. People were surrounding Hull House looking for stories of the Devil Baby, looking for it. But in one of Jane Addams' books, she actually wrote that she noticed a lot of women were coming by looking for the Devil Baby. So she theorized that the Devil Baby, the people weren't really looking for the Devil Baby itself, but the Devil Baby was almost like an outlet for a lot of these people, especially women. So there's a lot of different interpretations you can come from it. You can think about it as anxieties about men's infidelity at the time. You can think about it as religious anxiety. What happens when, essentially you're in a new world and there's a bunch of new religions. How does that conflict manifest in itself? There's also some people take it as a metaphor of really a fear of children, fear of motherhood, fear of parenthood. There's a lot things like that, and just or even injustice. So like a lot of people interpreted the husband as abusive. So the baby could have been a manifestation of really a lot of these injustices that women faced at the time. So depending on what interpretation you take, the Devil Baby is actually a really good teaching tool. So really, it's really a really interesting look into the folklore and history and how you can connect it to today. So actually, Audrey, do you have any favorite visitor stories about asking for the Devil Baby, things like that?
Lots of school children usually come in and asking just point blank, where is the baby? Which is one of my favorite questions, and I don't have an answer for them. I say, I don't know where you heard that we have a baby, but we don't, but we have a really interesting label about the story, and specifically about all of the times that Jane Addams had to write about the Devil Baby. This story of the Devil Baby, for lack of a better word, really did haunt Jane Addams for a lot of her time at Hull House. Yeah. He also writes about a couple different times, right? In the Atlantic, which you can read today. If you just Google Jane Addams Atlantic Devil Baby, it'll be right up there, as well as in her later memoirs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really loved when the ghost tours would come by around Hull House. So if you ever come by, if you're visiting Hull House when we reopen and the ghost tours come by, it really becomes a fishbowl. People surround you looking in for the Devil Baby. You see the occasional earmark from people trying to listen in late at night. It's a fun time working here at the Hull House.
It's a fun time, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then, this is another really common question we get. Was Jane Addams a lesbian, right? Or just more broadly, what was her sexuality? We get a lot of questions about Jane Addams' own romantic life. Jane Addams never married. She never had a child. And she had a lifelong partnership with a woman named Mary Rose Smith. I'm gonna go to the next slide. We can actually see some of these photographs of Mary Rose Smith and Jane Addams. Mary Rose Smith was, I would say, Jane Addams' most important person in her life. She was really central to all of her years at Hull House. The two never married, like I said, but they did travel extensively together. They considered adopting a child together. They had a summer home together in Maine. Jane Addams wrote this really beautiful poem to Mary Rose Smith that you can see in our virtual tour. And they spent their lives together. So does this qualify as a gay relationship, queer, lesbian, right? We have so many of these different terms today that we could ascribe to them. And the museum chooses the word queer, right, to describe Jane Addams and Mary Rose Smith. We say that they are queer partners. Now, queer, the word, used to be a derogatory term, right? Meaning weird or unusual. Today, it's been reclaimed by some people in the LGBTQ community to mean anything that's not straight, right? Anyone who lives or loves outside of that heteronormative patriarchal model. And these two women who never married, didn't have children, lived pretty peculiar lives at HullHouse doing the radical work that they were doing, we think that they do fit into this queer umbrella term, right? And while it might not have been so central to Jane Addams, right, that identity or that word that we want to, as historians, we want to put in a little box, what's really important here is the relationship itself. They were just incredibly, incredibly close. They had a really deep love for each other. And I love this portrait on the right here of Mary Rose Smith. And rumor has it that Jane Addams would travel, whenever Mary Rose Smith couldn't go with her, she would ship this portrait to wherever she was going, which I think is a pretty strong declaration of love. I don't think you just do that for a friend, right? And also, this could have been what was called a Boston marriage. That term, Boston marriage, kind of alluding to the women's colleges that were popping up on the East Coast at the late 1800s, early 1900s. A Boston marriage meaning two women who chose to live with each other for the rest of their lives, right? Often college-educated women, hence that Boston Women's College allusion. So Mary Rose Smith used to be really erased out of the story of Jane Addams, but at the museum, we try to reinstate her as such a central character because we know how important she was to Jane Addams. She was really the only person that Jane Addams could just be a person around, right? Jane Addams was traveling the world, doing all of these lectures and worrying about where the next funds were coming from. But with Mary Rose Smith, they could just be two people, right? And that's all that anyone wants to be, just be seen and heard by a close partner. So that is the answer to, was Jane Addams a lesbian? We don't know. But we do know that this relationship was really, really central to both of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually a little fun story about the painting. So we actually have the painting in Jane Addams' bedroom at the museum. If when we reopen, definitely come by to see it. But probably my favorite story about the painting is what allegedly Jane Addams did with it. So Jane Addams was a public intellectual. She was having lectures all across the United States, even internationally. And allegedly, Jane Addams would actually ship this portrait to wherever she was traveling. So you can't really see it in the photo itself, but this was a pretty big portrait. How big would you say this portrait is?
I don't know. It's it's massive, really. I don't know. I'm really bad at judging sizes, but maybe like 5 feet tall.
Yeah, it's a hefty portrait, and imagine doing that for someone who's just your friend.
Yeah,
I
know. Today we might think of like having your phone background dedicated to your loved one or a close friend, but that wasn't enough for Jane Addams. No, they needed this. I always like to look at this portrait too, because I think her posture is so interesting here. She doesn't look like she's in a corset. She's not really smiling. She looks kind of tired. It's just a really interesting choice, whether it was Mary Rose Smith, her choice, or maybe the painter's choice. This was painted by Alice Kellogg Tyler, who was one of the only women whose works were chosen to be displayed at the 1893 World's Fair. And we actually have one of the paintings that was chosen to be on display in the museum. It wasn't this one. It's called Mother and Child, and you can see it in our virtual tour.
Mm-hmm. Right in the children's room, next to the front door.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
right.
The check-in. Did we get any questions from the Facebook chat by any chance?
Yeah, we have a question, actually, sorry, here in our chat, and that would be, what is some of the more radical work that was being done at Hull House?
The first thing that comes to mind is just who was coming to Hull House, right? And Jane Addams' own affiliations, like her friendship with Leo Tolstoy, right, who we actually have a portrait of in her bedroom, right, famed anarchist. There's a very funny, I think it's funny, a very funny story about their first meeting, where Leo Tolstoy makes a comment about Jane Addams's dress. And she kind of puts him in his place, I think. We have the story, you might not be able to read it on the virtual tour, but she writes about it in one of her later writings. Eddie, any thoughts?
I think of the other reformers at Hull House actually. So actually Hull House was actually co-founded. So there was Jane Addams, there was also Ellen Gates Starr, and there's also Mary Kaiser, who doesn't get as much attention as the first two. But Ellen Gates Starr has a lot of history, and it's like the amount of stuff she did was wild. So she was devout Catholic, but also devout labor organizer. She was doing strikes, joining picket lines. She was getting arrested all the time. She tried to run for alderman when women were not allowed to run for office at the time. She was doing a lot of the on the grounds work. So I would say she's a very direct contrast to, I would argue Jane Addams was a very reformist. She was very into top level policy issues. She was looking for really government relationships. Ellen Gates Starr was not really there for that. She was really more grassroots, on the grounds, really direct action focused and things like that. And also, yeah, so that's actually what caused a little bit of friction between the two. There was a really big difference of ideals, politics, actions. And toward the later years at Hull House, they actually did choose to go their separate ways. And yeah, with that progressive era mindset, there were a lot of different reformers and activists that came through the Hull House, some of them being a lot more direct action focused. I also think of people like, what's her name? Florence Kelley. So she was a major labor organizer and researcher as well. If you come down to the Hull House when we reopened, we actually talk a lot about maps and papers, which was this huge study conducted by Florence Kelley and a team of researchers. So she's most known for that work, but she's also known as a lawyer and a really staunch socialist and really against the really big, huge offenses of capitalism. And a lot of times we don't hear from a lot of the very far left reformers, people working here at the Hull House. If anyone here is a PhD student listening, you need a dissertation idea, I would suggest that help us out with a lot of our research and things like that. But yeah, there's a rich history of people outside of Jane Addams that were doing a lot of radical work during this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Any other questions from the chat or Facebook?
Actually, one from the Google form that we had sent out before, but someone put in there, where did the funding for Hull House come from?
Yeah, we actually have that. Is that the next question? Nope, we'll go. How was Hull House funded, right? Where did all of the money come from? Great question, and it's actually mostly Jane Addams. Jane Addams's father, John Huey Addams, was a very successful businessman. He was also an Illinois state senator. He was close personal friends with Abraham Lincoln. And when he passed away, he left Jane Addams an inheritance of today's equivalent of $1.3 million. And that is really the pot of money that Hull House started from. However, after that money ran out, she did rely on those private donations, kind of just the goodwill of her extensive network in Chicago. And also Ellen Gates Starr, the co-founder, was a teacher, and she really relied on her teacher network as well to, come and sponsor a building or sponsor a class, things like that. So it ended up, kind of resembling mutual aid a little bit, right? Of like pooling money. What does the community need? Where can we fund?
Mhm.
Eddie, anything
Yeah.
to add?
Also, yeah, and also, I mentioned a little bit earlier that Hull House changed hands a little bit. So after Charles Hull died, this house was actually left to his cousin, Helen Culver, and she was kind of like shopping around for a little bit. That's actually when Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr, fresh from London, Toynbee Hall, were actually looking for spaces. They actually read up on Charles Hull's obituary and met up with Helen Culver. Helen Culver actually was convinced to let them use the space rent-free for 25 years, just so long as it kept Hull in its name. So for the first couple years at Hull House, they were able to go rent-free because they kept Hull in its name. So that's why we call Hull House to this day.
Mhm.
So after Jane Addams' time, there was a lot of changes in leadership. It became a lot more of a formal nonprofit organization. And over time, funding shift sources actually changed a lot. So actually, fun fact, I'm actually a master's student in a little bit of public administration. So we actually just talked about this and really changes in the non-government nonprofit section throughout the second half of the 20th century. So during times of the New Deal, the Reagan years, and then also in the 90s when a lot of government aid becomes really third party based, like a lot of these NGOs, a lot of these nonprofit institutions receive a ton of money to actually run services for the government. So toward the later years in Hull House's history, a lot of funding was largely coming from grants. A lot of it is coming from really these government-based grants. The early years was funded mostly through private philanthropy. That sort of teetered off toward the end. So that actually kind of talks a little bit about the end of Hull House back in 2012. What happened was over time, money just kind of began to dry up, especially during that time. If anyone remembers back in the day, there was a huge budget crisis back in 2012. Essentially, the Illinois government couldn't agree on a budget. And kind of like what we see today, unfortunately, a lot of organizations couldn't afford to keep their doors open. Probably one of the more tragic things we hear about Hull House closing its doors was actually a lot of the final employees never got their final paychecks just because money was so scarce back then. And what happened was we actually still get phone calls to this day, people looking for services from Hull House Association, which was rebranded back in the 60s. So really the end of Hull House was kind of a tragic one in a sense, I would say.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's kind of leads to a different question that we get that's not on here, but what happened to Hull House, right? Where did it go? Is it still up today? How does it exist today? Is it just the museum? And this goes back to the 50s, right? With Mayor Daley Sr. He starts his plan for urban renewal, which means, right, tear down all the old buildings, put up new ones. At the same time, the university, UIC, needed a new campus because they were originally on Navy Pier and they were expecting a lot of new students to enroll after the war. And so eventually the Harrison and Halstead site where Hull House was located was chosen to be this new campus for UIC. This was a 2-year legal battle. The Hull House neighbors, namely Florence Scala and Jesse Binford, organized extensively to put up this fight because they did not want to let Hull House go. This was a 2-year legal battle. It went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, where eventually the US Supreme Court ruled that eminent domain would grant the university the right to the land. Eminent domain being that clause that says the government wants property, and if it's for the common good, and if the owners are compensated, they can do that, right? However, most people in the HullHouse neighborhood were not owning their property, right? They were renting it. So they were never compensated in that deal and were after displaced. So 11 of the 13 buildings of HullHouse were razed, leaving only 2, which are now, they now comprise the museum, right? So there's the Hull Mansion, where the museum is located, and next door there's the residence dining hall. And both of them, the museum in general, are now owned by the university. We're under the university's College of Art, Design, and Architecture. And right, I think Eddie touched on the HullHouse Association, which was basically 30 sites over the city, mostly doing job placement, social service agency work like that. And they exactly ran out until 2012, where they closed their doors due to that budget crisis that you had talked about. But the museum still exists today, and you can, when we reopen, come and visit us. But until then, definitely check out the virtual tour. It's almost like being inside.
And the museum is a National Historic Landmark, so it can't be touched for a long time.
Yeah, right. And the residence dining hall next door is a Chicago Historic Landmark. So it's secure.
So.
All right, I think we've got one more question that we kind of passed over. But what was Jane Addams's involvement on voting activism and suffrage? Eddie, you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yes. So Jane Addams was very vocal for women's suffrage back in the early 1900s. So actually, this is actually all available online, but what you can do is look up why women should vote Jane Addams, and you can actually find the article that she wrote for Ladies' Home Journal back in 1910. So TLDR, too long, don't read. But essentially, she was really focusing in on how women were actually super impacted by politics that were, voted on. So what happened was she was kind of going around and she was noticing all the women being affected by huge piles of garbage. So backtrack. So back in the 19th Ward where HullHouse was located, it was actually ran by a very corrupt alderman, where essentially garbage pickup was, you had paid garbage pickup workers, but they didn't have to do their jobs essentially. And being what was called a slum back then, there wasn't really a lot of political pressure to pick up the garbage in the neighborhood. Jane Addams and a lot of the reformers there were trying to gather enough political power to actually deal with the garbage issue. But there's a lot of history. Short story, didn't go great for Jane Addams and the reformers at HullHouse. But she noticed that, so a lot of the issues were coming from elected officials. So back in the day, women didn't have the same political expectations. A lot of times the domestic sphere, pretty much the only place where women were expected to worry about was the home. The thing is, Jane Addams noticed the home is directly political. It's a space where women are affected by elected officials. So the thesis of the essay was that women should have the right to vote because their lives are impacted by elected officials and political powers. So, we read back in 2020, obviously women can do a lot more than inside the house now, and obviously they should. So we, read back and say, okay, that's an interesting take. But again, we take it in context. Back in 1910, you gotta make things do as you do. But she wasn't just writing, she was actually doing a lot of organizational work. So she was actually a member of back then the Chicago Political Equality League back in 1912, where she actually helped manage to win a limited suffrage in Illinois, where women could vote in federal and municipal elections back in 1913. Jane Addams was actually also vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, And when a 19th Amendment that allowed women to vote back in 1920, 100-year anniversary in 2020, is that she was actually then became an active member of the League of Women Voters, who are still active today, and really were huge on educating voters and ballot issues. So really, voting was a major part of really a lot of the civil rights activism that Jane Addams was kind of like stepping her toes in back in the day. So yes, she was very active in fighting for women's suffrage back, especially in Illinois.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can actually check out our current exhibit called Why Women Should Vote after her essay on our virtual tour. And you can look at both the Illinois level, talking about women's suffrage in the state, and also nationally. And we've got some great info on organizing done by Ida B. Wells, who was a contemporary of Jane Addams, as well as a few different marches in the state as well. All right. Any other questions that we have in the chat? I think that's the end of our questions. And right here, we've got some suggested reading if you're interested, right? This is kind of the go-to list. 20 Years at Hull-House, right? Of course, Jane Addams' famous account. And then Citizen, which is kind of like the Bible, as I would say, on Jane Addams' own life. That one is by Louise W. Knight. And then HullHouse Maps and Papers, which is that seminal study that Eddie had talked about earlier. Those three will really give you a good jumping off point into a little bit of the history, right? Because there's so much to go through. Do we have any other questions in the chat or Facebook?
So pulling through the Google questions again, one of them is, were there any men at Hull-House and what type of work were they doing?
Yes, so there were men at Hull-House, although they were outnumbered, about 2 to 1. And that was more or less intentional, right? Because Jane Addams and Ellen Gate Starr were 2 women, and they thought, well, we can't hide the fact that we're women, right? Like Toynbee Hall, that model settlement house that they had kind of taken the idea of, was run by almost entirely men, right? That's who were on college campuses back then. And Jane Addams and Ellen Gate Starr wanted to create an intentional space for women like themselves, those college-educated women at Hull-House, but it wasn't just women. So men as well who wanted to start their careers, start their practices, also came to Hull-House to do similar work, right? Eddie, can you think of any male residents that stick out to you?
We got Victor Yaros, Jesus Torres.
Did Jesus Torres live at Hull-House? I think he was.
Yeah, I think he was there all the time. I don't know if he actually lived there. Yeah, there's not a lot of recorded history about male reformers. We definitely know they were there. Yeah, it's just because there were so many women at Hull-House. I forget the source, but Hull-House has been called a feminist utopia. Other scholars have called it a queer domesticity. So that means that this Hull-House was a really wild space to be, especially in the early 1900s when gender roles were so strict. The idea of a very female-dominant and also female-led space was almost inconceivable for a lot of powers that be at the time, and especially unmarried men and women living in the same space. Really, Hull-House was kind of scandalous back in the day. This is why some historians call it a queer domesticity, because it breaks the rules of marriage, men and women live together outside of marriage, kind of working together on almost equal planes. It was, living at Hull-House was quite an abnormal experience in the context of the early 1900s. Actually, a big question we get, this is actually a big homework question, so any students listening in, this is a good homework/essay question, is really the impact of industrialization on Chicago and Hull-House's really work with that kind of context. So America was actually the second industrial revolution, the first one happening in Europe, especially around London, where factories, mass production are really scaling up super rapidly. So working in the factories means a lot of jobs are popping up. This is why tons of immigration is happening in the United States, because that's where all the jobs are. In the 19th Ward, the West Side, the main industry in this neighborhood is going to be the garment district, or textiles, clothes, things like that. And I'm not sure if anyone has read The Jungle in their English classes, but working in factories was not a fun time in the early 1900s, late 1800s. This is a time before labor rights, labor regulations, safety protocol. So if you've read The Jungle, you can only imagine what it's like working in the textile garment district. So children as young as 5 can be found working in the factories. People are working hours and hours on end, 6 days a week. And what happened was, without safety regulations, people are getting their limbs caught in machines. People are getting crushed by heavy machinery. It's not a fun time to working in the factories during the industrial era. So HullHouse had a ton of people working on labor rights, labor safety, and really fighting for change and safer and higher wages for a lot of the people working in the labor, in the factories. So I mentioned again, maps and papers are going to come up a lot, but what Florence Kelly and her team was really ask everyone in the neighborhood, how much money are you making? And back in the day, you could be making between $1 to $20. So $20 is approximate about $600. So imagine you're making $600 a week. You know, that's not great, but you can make do, especially accounting for inflation today. $5 is a quarter of that. You're making $150 a week in today's money. That's impossible, especially if you're raising a family back in the day. So by having this information quantified, this was a huge way of increasing wages for different people. Also, there's people like Alice Hamilton. She's considered one of the founders of occupational health and also industrial toxicology in the United States. Her research was really one of the first to look at the impact of lead and its health effects. If you don't know, lead was everywhere in the early 1900s. It's in your gas, it's in your paint, it's in your water, it's everywhere. And really, her research was some of the first actually found that the major health issues that heavy lead poisoning will actually do to people, and it messed people up. So really, her research was foundational in setting up those occupational safety hazards and things like that. Audrey, do you have anything about like industrialization, how much of a mess it was for people living here?
Well, no, I'm just thinking about feedback. I'm just thinking about Alice Hamilton and her work, actually how it related to the HullHouse kilns, right? Mm-hmm. With the glaze. And they recognized that, hey, this glaze that we're using is actually really dangerous. And kind of how that's kind of a microcosm for how HullHouse worked, right? The research going on over here informs the work that they're doing over here, and maybe they're doing some theater about it over there, right? It really is this kind of growing ecosystem of information and debate and just discourse, really. It kind of did model like a college campus in that sense, but it was of and for the community.
Mm-hmm. So you actually touched on one of my favorite rooms in HullHouse, the room up at the HullHouse Kilns. So the HullHouse Kilns is probably one of my favorite rooms at the HullHouse Museum. So the kilns were started off by an arts professor named Myrtle French. She actually did a lot of her work with the School of Art Institute of Chicago, but she was also a resident of HullHouse, and she was one of the first to actually start the HullHouse Kilns. So the HullHouse Kilns actually had a ton of impact in the world of ceramics. It's actually, if you want to look up more information, look up Pots of Promise, if someone can type that in the group chat. So the HullHouse Kilns were really famous in the pottery world and actually funded a lot of the services through the sales at the HullHouse Kiln store. So the kilns were actually a major meeting space for a lot of the newly arriving Mexican immigrants, especially in the early mid 1900s. when a lot of Mexican immigrants are escaping the Mexican Civil War, and also where all the jobs are coming in the U.S. and a lot of the immigration being cyclical. So really, a lot of the new Mexican immigrants were kind of hunkering down at the kilns because a lot of them had previous knowledge of kilns back in Mexico, and mixing in traditional Mexican styles of pottery with kilns made the kilns really popular all across the United States. And, a lot of the pottery is actually collectible today. So if you have any, eBay or donate to the museum, please.
Right, and it was also a means for them to sustain themselves, right? The kilns had a shop on Michigan Avenue where 45% of the proceeds went directly to the artists. So it was a really attractive alternative to working in the factories and the sweatshops, right? And it was safer. Maybe not with the lead glaze, but after.
I think in HullHouse, they actually made a glaze that didn't use lead. I think it was potassium. There's a lot of chemistry. There's a lot of chemistry. We cover all our bases at the HullHouse.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of different domains coming in to the same conversation.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
So
well, we have about 8 minutes left. Are there any lingering questions that we have?
Again, from Google, the Google form, if you can talk more about the kind of work that people were doing there. I know that you all mentioned some of it earlier, but there was a question there asking about what other kind of work that isn't that well known at HullHouse.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, if there's other work that was happening at HullHouse, outside of Jane Addams and kind of the main people that you hear about. Again, you all touched on it a little bit earlier and some throughout the discussion, but if you can just talk a little bit more about that, maybe some other people that work there and things that they were doing.
Well, I'll quickly talk about the theater program because that's just my personal domain. Theater, right, the little theater movement really has credited HullHouse as the origin, the birthplace of the little theater movement. Theater was a huge social activity at HullHouse, and it was mostly used to help socialize children and immigrant children in working together and putting on plays. And also improvisation, which Chicago is so known for today, really finds its roots at HullHouse. So a woman named Viola Spolin was a student of someone named Neva Boyd, who was all about learning through play, right? And what it means for children's brains to be developing. They need this outlet of play to really make those connections. Viola Spolin then was a student at the HullHouse Recreational Training School. And then Viola Spolin led the HullHouse Players, which were an amateur group, not an amateur group, a very pre-professional group, I would say, of theater artists at HullHouse. And then Viola Spolin developed theater games as we know it today. And she has written several books on theater games in the classroom and how they can be used to connect different learning models. Her son, Paul Sills, would go on to co-found the Second City in Chicago, which is pretty much I would say the birthplace of improv as we know it today, but maybe I'm biased because I love Chicago and I love Chicago theater. So really we see this long lineage of theater for social change, right? Theater as socialization, but also theater for theater's sake, right? And art for art's sake. Eddie, are you thinking of anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, like if you've ever played Zip Zap Zop, you can thank HullHouse for that.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Let's see. We've talked about so many people. It's just, I think we can talk about Rochelle Yaros and really kind of the foundations of really like accessible gynecology for a lot of new immigrants, a lot of new residents coming in, is really that kind of this public health mindset. A lot of that really has a huge start at the HullHouse and like providing access to affordable care for people, because back then, really, I don't want to, it really was back in the day, get sick and die, because like a lot of times healthcare was very unaffordable. Also, quality was kind of hit or miss depending on really how rich you were. And really, HullHouse and a lot of the medical professionals I was working with in the space really were dedicated to providing accessible, affordable healthcare, which really is still an issue to this day, especially now we see in 2020. And I think a lot of the questions that the reformers and activists working in HullHouse are still issues today that we really are trying to still solve 100 years later, which I think is really fascinating to see how like long the lineage of this activism is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking of there was the HullHouse Nursery, right, where children could go and receive childcare, or rather parents could go and drop their children off. But also right next door, there was a birth control clinic, right? So it was kind of like a one-stop shop for parents who were figuring out birth control or how to, best practices for their household, how to rear their children, things like that. So they really did care about the whole spectrum of care at HullHouse. And I think that's pretty novel for what it was at the time that it existed.
Mm-hmm. So we have only 3 minutes. Does anyone have any burning questions popping up? No pressure if there isn't.
I don't have any. Nadia, if you have any last ones for the last couple of minutes.
Nope, don't have any on my end.
All right, that's no big deal. So if anyone has any questions regarding that was brought up during this chat or anything that comes up naturally, we actually do have an email list that you can submit questions to. It's jahh@uic.edu. That is JAHH, JA, or something like that, at uic.edu. You can also visit our website at hullhousemuseum.org. Just type in HullHouse Museum on your normal search bar. It'll usually pop up on the first link. And there you can find a ton of information regarding HullHouse and hopefully can answer some of your questions.
Yeah, and also that's where you'll find the virtual tour. We have this really exciting 360 degrees virtual tour that we just launched a couple weeks ago. So definitely check that out if you have been to HullHouse before, or if this is your first time. Definitely worth a visit.
And with that, we want to thank you so much for stopping by, asking your questions. This was a really exciting thing that we can start doing, especially with the virtual programming. If you like, definitely leave a comment, any suggestions, or if you'd like another version of this Q&A session, definitely let us know in the comments or send us an email, whatever you'd like. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well. This was the first family day homework help type thing, and we really hope you enjoyed it. We hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.